Rotero, The Truman Show is not fiction. It's how power watches you. Michel Foucault. You know that feeling when you suddenly become aware of yourself in the middle of doing something completely ordinary, like you're washing dishes or walking down the street, and suddenly you feel this weird self-consciousness, this sense that you're performing your own life instead of just living it. You catch yourself adjusting your posture, smoothing your hair, changing your expression, even though you're completely alone, or maybe you're not alone. Maybe that's the point, because here's the disturbing truth. You've learned to watch yourself the way others watch you. You've become your own surveillance camera, your own prison guard, monitoring every move, judging every thought, correcting every impulse before it even has a chance to become real. You thought you were being responsible, mature, self-aware. But what if I told you that this constant self-monitoring isn't freedom or growth, but a form of control so sophisticated that you don't even realize it's happening? What if the prison you're trying to escape is one you've built inside your own mind, and the guard you're trying to please is a version of yourself that was never really yours to begin with? There's something profoundly unsettling about The Truman Show that goes far beyond its premise of a man living in a fabricated reality. What really disturbs us isn't just that Truman is being watched without knowing it. It's the uncomfortable recognition that we too live under a gaze we can't quite locate or escape. We feel it in those moments when we're alone, but still performing, still curating, still editing ourselves for an invisible audience that somehow feels more real than our own privacy. Michel Foucault, spent his life trying to understand this strange phenomenon, this way that power operates not through force or obvious coercion, but through our own internalized sense of being watched, evaluated, measured against invisible standards that we didn't choose but can't seem to reject. Think about your daily life for a moment. How many times do you make decisions not based on what you actually want or feel, but on what you imagine others would think of you if they knew? You're getting ready in the morning, and you choose your clothes not just for comfort or personal taste, but with a mental calculation of how you'll be perceived. You're about to post something on social media, and you pause, reread, edit, delete, rewrite, imagining the reactions, the judgments, the silent evaluations of people you may never even meet. You're alone in your apartment, and you still find yourself straightening up, staying productive, maintaining certain standards, as if someone might walk in at any moment and find you wanting. But here's the thing that Foucault understood so deeply. Nobody needs to actually be watching for this mechanism to work. The power of surveillance isn't in the actual eyes observing you. It's in the possibility of being observed, the uncertainty of whether you're being watched or not, which eventually leads you to behave as if you're always being watched. You become both the prisoner and the guard, the observed and the observer, trapped in a feedback loop of self-regulation that feels like freedom, but functions like a cage. This is what Foucault called the panopticon, borrowing from Jeremy Bentham's prison design, where a single guard tower could potentially observe all prisoners, but the prisoners could never know when they were actually being watched. The brilliance, the horror really, of this design is that it doesn't require constant surveillance. It only requires the possibility of surveillance, the architecture that makes being watched feel perpetually possible. And once that possibility is established, the prisoners start to police themselves. They internalize the gaze, they become their own jailers. Now you might be thinking, okay, but I'm not in prison, I'm not being controlled like that. But Foucault's radical insight was that modern society has essentially turned the entire social world into a panopticon. Schools, workplaces, social media platforms, even our own minds, all operate on this same principle. We've learned to monitor ourselves constantly, to measure ourselves against norms and standards that we didn't create, but have fully absorbed. We do this so automatically, so naturally, that we mistake it for our own authentic judgment. We think we're being our true selves when we're actually performing a version of ourselves that has been shaped, molded, disciplined by invisible forces of social control. And here's where it gets even more complex, even more insidious, because this isn't happening through obvious oppression or violent enforcement. Nobody is forcing you at gunpoint to behave a certain way. Instead, What Foucault called biopower operates through norms, expectations, expert knowledge, and institutions that all work together to define what counts as normal, healthy, productive, successful, attractive, acceptable. You're not being told you must conform. You're being offered incentives, given opportunities, shown models of success, taught to aspire to certain identities and lifestyles. And when you fall short of these standards, which are designed to be perpetually out of reach, you don't blame the system that set impossible benchmarks. You blame yourself. You internalize the failure. You work harder to fix yourself, to optimize yourself, to become the kind of person who deserves success, happiness, recognition. This is the genius of modern power. It doesn't crush. Resistance. It produces subjects who resist their own resistance, who police their own thoughts and desires before any external authority needs to intervene. The Truman Show captures this perfectly in that moment when Truman starts to suspect something is wrong. He doesn't rebel against obvious tyranny. He rebels against the subtle wrongness of a life that feels scripted, controlled, performed rather than lived. Everyone around him tells him he's free, that he's lucky, that he has everything he could want. But he feels the invisible walls, the subtle redirections, the way every spontaneous impulse gets channeled back into acceptable patterns. And when he finally tries to leave, when he tries to break out of the dome, it's not because he knows what's on the other side. It's because he can no longer tolerate living in a reality that isn't real, even if that reality is comfortable, safe, predictable. This is the moment of resistance that Foucault believed was always possible, always present, even in the most total systems of control. Because power isn't just something imposed on us from above. It's a relationship, a dynamic, a set of forces that flow through every interaction, every institution, every moment of self-reflection. And wherever there's power, there's the possibility of resistance, of refusing the role you've been assigned, of questioning the norms you've internalized, of breaking the fourth wall of your own carefully constructed life. But resistance isn't simple or straightforward. It's not just a matter of saying no or dropping out or rejecting everything, because we're not standing outside the system looking in. We're products of it, shaped by it, our very sense of self formed through the same mechanisms we're trying to resist. This is what Foucault meant by subjectification, the process through which we become subjects. We're not born with a fixed, authentic self that gets corrupted by society. We're constituted as selves through language, culture, institutions, power relations. Our deepest desires, our sense of identity, our experience of freedom itself, all of this is mediated through systems of knowledge and power that we didn't create and don't fully control. So when you feel that impulse to break free, to be your authentic self, to escape the performance, you have to ask, what is this authentic self I'm trying to return to? Is there a true me underneath all the social conditioning? Or is the very idea of an authentic self another story I've been told, another norm I'm trying to conform to? This paradox sits at the heart of Foucault's work, and it's uncomfortable because it doesn't offer easy solutions. It doesn't promise that if you just find your true self or reject social norms or move to a desert island, you'll finally be free. Instead, it suggests that freedom is always partial, always situated, always a matter of negotiating with and within structures of power that we can resist but never fully escape. But this doesn't mean we're doomed to be puppets or that resistance is futile. What it means is that we need to be more sophisticated in how we understand both power and freedom. We need to recognize that the enemy isn't just out there in institutions or authorities or systems. It's also in here, in the way we've learned to govern ourselves, to discipline our own bodies and minds, to evaluate ourselves according to standards that serve someone else's interests before our own. Let me tell you about someone I once knew, a woman named Sarah who worked in corporate marketing. Sarah was good at her job, by all external measures successful. She had the title, the salary, the apartment in a nice neighborhood, but she described her life as feeling like she was constantly on camera, constantly performing a role she'd perfected but never chose. Every morning she'd rehearse conversations in her head, anticipating objections, preparing responses, managing perceptions. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had a spontaneous thought that didn't immediately get filtered through the question, but how would that look? When she finally had what she called her breakdown, which was really more of a breakthrough, it wasn't dramatic or cinematic. She was in a meeting presenting a campaign she didn't believe in, using language that felt foreign in her mouth, and she just stopped mid-sentence. Not because she couldn't continue, but because she suddenly saw herself from the outside, saw the performance, saw the invisible cameras she'd been playing to her entire adult life, and she realized she didn't know who would be left if she stopped performing. That terrified her more than anything. But it also opened a question, created a crack in the dome, what Foucault would have called a practice of freedom. Not freedom as a final state to achieve, but freedom as an ongoing practice of questioning, resisting, refusing to be governed in certain ways, at certain costs, by certain truths that claim to define who you are and what you should want. So what does this actually look like in practice? How do you begin to dismantle the panopticon you've built in your own mind? Foucault would say it starts with what he called critical attitude, a kind of permanent vigilance toward the present, a refusal to accept things as they are simply because they are. It means examining the invisible, assumptions that structure your life. Why do you believe you need to be productive all the time? Who benefits from your constant self-optimization? What would happen if you stopped trying to fix yourself and instead questioned the standards you're failing to meet? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're tools for excavating the archaeology of your own subjectivity, for uncovering the historical and social forces that have made you who you are. When you start to see yourself not as a fixed essence, but as a product of specific practices, institutions, and power relations, something shifts. You realize you have more room to maneuver than you thought. Not infinite freedom, not escape from all constraint, but the possibility of relating to yourself differently, of practicing what Foucault called care of the self, which isn't self-help or self-improvement, but a more fundamental art of existence. This care of the self that Foucault explored in his later work, drawing from ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, isn't about following rules or conforming to ideals. It's about cultivating a relationship with yourself that isn't based on judgment, surveillance, or constant evaluation. It's about creating practices, rituals, ways of being that feel genuinely yours, even if they're cobbled together from cultural materials that preceded you. The ancient philosophers practiced daily self-examination, but not to catch themselves in moral failures or to punish deviance from norms. They examined themselves to understand their own patterns, their reactions, their attachments, with a kind of curiosity and even affection. They wrote journals not to track productivity or optimize habits, but to process experience, to engage in what one philosopher called the cultivation of a view. This is so different from the self-surveillance we practice today, where every moment of introspection becomes another opportunity for self-criticism, another data point in an endless project of self-improvement that can never be completed because the standards keep shifting, the goalposts keep moving. What if you approached yourself with that ancient curiosity instead of modern judgment? What if you observed your patterns not to fix them, but to understand them? What if you took seriously the possibility that some of what you consider your flaws or failures are actually reasonable responses to unreasonable demands, rational adaptations to irrational systems? This doesn't mean you can't change or grow. It means you change from a different place, not from self-loathing or fear of judgment, but from a genuine investigation into what kind of life you actually want to live, what kind of person you want to become. Not according to external standards, but according to your own carefully examined values. And yes, even those values are influenced by culture and history and power, but that doesn't make them less yours. It just means you own them more consciously, hold them more lightly, revise them more willingly, when they stop serving the life you're trying to build. The Truman Show ends with Truman walking through the door, stepping out of the dome into an uncertain world. It's presented as triumph, as liberation, and in many ways it is. But Foucault would remind us that walking out of one dome doesn't mean you're free of all domes. It means you're entering a different set of constraints, different power relations, different ways of being watched and evaluated. The freedom isn't in escaping all structures. It's in becoming aware of them, in choosing which ones to inhabit and how to inhabit them, in retaining the capacity to walk away when the cost of staying becomes too high. It's in remembering that you are not just the product of these structures, you're also an agent within them, capable of resistance, refusal, reinvention, even if those acts of freedom are always partial, always complicated, always embedded in relations you didn't fully choose. This is hard work, this kind of freedom. It's much easier to just follow the script, to accept the role you've been given, to optimize yourself according to external metrics and call it success. And there's no moral judgment here. We all do this, we all have to do this to some extent to function in the world. But Foucault's invitation is to notice when you're doing it, to recognize the mechanisms, to see the invisible cameras you've internalized, and to ask whether you want to keep performing for them or whether you might, in small ways or large, start living a different kind of life. Not a perfect life, not a life free from all power or constraint, but a life that feels more genuinely yours, even in its imperfections, even in its ongoing negotiations with structures you can't fully escape. The panopticon of modern life is real. The self-surveillance is real. The internalized judgment, the constant performance, the exhausting work of being perpetually acceptable and productive and optimized, all of it is real. But so is your capacity to notice it, to name it, to resist it in ways large and small. So is your ability to cultivate practices of freedom, to care for yourself in ways that aren't about meeting external standards, but about building a life you can actually inhabit without constant self-alienation. This isn't easy. It requires ongoing attention, repeated choices, willingness to fail and try again. But it's possible. And it starts with seeing the dome, recognizing the cameras, understanding that the life you think is yours might be a life you've been cast in, and asking what would happen if you stopped reading from the script, even for a moment, even just to see what your own voice sounds like when it's not performing for an invisible audience that might not even be watching. You are not Truman, trapped in a literal dome with actual cameras recording your every move, but you are living in structures of power and surveillance that are just as real, just as pervasive, and in some ways more insidious because they're invisible, internalized, mistaken for your own authentic choices and desires. The first step toward any kind of freedom is seeing these structures, naming them, understanding how they work through you as much as on you. And that's not a comfortable process. It's unsettling. It raises questions that don't have easy answers, but it's also the only way out of the dome you didn't know you were living in, the only way to stop being both prisoner and guard in your own life, the only way to start practicing the kind of freedom that isn't given to you by any external authority, but created by you through the difficult ongoing work of becoming someone you can actually recognize in the mirror.